Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we are stepping into one of the most complex and far-reaching conflicts of the modern world. The Vietnam War was not only a clash of armies. It was a collision of ideas, ambitions, fears, and hopes that stretched across continents and generations. It unfolded in dense jungles and crowded cities, in distant government offices, and inside ordinary homes where decisions made far away suddenly felt very close. This was a war shaped by history, by colonial legacies, and by the immense pressures of the Cold War. It changed how wars were fought, how they were reported, and how societies understood power, protest, and responsibility. Its echoes can still be felt today in politics, in culture, and in the lives of families who continue to carry its memories. As we explore this story, you will encounter moments of resilience, tragedy, courage, and contradiction. This is a journey through time that asks us to sit with complexity rather than easy answers. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, allow your shoulders to soften. Let your breathing slow. Feel the tension gently release from your body as your mind begins to wander through this remarkable chapter of history. Let's begin. The Vietnam War began because of a long struggle over who would control Vietnam and what kind of country it would become. After decades of French colonial rule, Vietnamese independence movements fought to end foreign control. When France was defeated in 1954, Vietnam was divided into two parts. The Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, sought national reunification under a socialist system. The anti-communist South, supported by the United States and its allies, aimed to remain separate. The war became part of the Cold War, as the United States feared that a communist victory would spread communism across Southeast Asia. Fighting involved North Vietnam and its allies, including the Viet Cong in the south, against South Vietnam, the United States, and other allied nations. What began as a regional struggle grew into a global conflict shaped by ideology, power, and fear. In Vietnam, reunification became the defining promise and the defining price. For many Vietnamese, the idea of one country was more than a slogan. It was tied to identity, history, and the ache of separation. Lines drawn on maps could cut through communities that had traded and married for generations. Families found themselves living under different administrations, with different rules and different fears. Reunification was imagined as a return to wholeness, yet the path toward it demanded extraordinary sacrifice. Each side claimed legitimacy, and each demanded loyalty. The promise of unity helped leaders ask for endurance through shortages, bombing, and loss. It also made compromise feel like betrayal. Over time, the goal shaped strategy and rhetoric. It framed suffering as necessary and temporary, even when years stretched into decades. When the fighting ended, unity did not erase grief. It gathered it into one nation that had to rebuild while carrying competing memories. The price of that promise was not only paid in battles. It was paid in the long effort to live together afterward. What began as decolonization became a Cold War crucible in Southeast Asia. Vietnam's struggle did not appear from nowhere. It rose from decades of foreign rule, wartime upheaval, and a fierce desire for self-determination. Leaders and movements argued over what freedom should look like and who had the right to claim it. Then the wider world stepped in and reframed the fight as a test of global alignment. Support and opposition started arriving with Cold War labels attached. Ideas about nationalism and reform became entangled with fears about dominoes, prestige, and rival blocs. That shift changed incentives on every side. It hardened rhetoric, narrowed compromises, and encouraged escalation when patience might have saved lives. For people on the ground, the stakes were still homes, harvests, and safety. For distant powers, the stakes became reputation and influence. The tragedy is that both levels were real, and they pulled against each other until the conflict grew into something vast. Mandatory military service made the war personal for many American households overnight. A letter could turn an ordinary week into a countdown. Young men faced medical exams, lottery numbers, deferments, and sudden training schedules that reshaped futures. Parents argued with each other about duty and danger. Friends watched their paths split. One might head to college. Another might be sent to basic training. Some tried to enlist in preferred branches. Some sought conscientious objector status through hearings that demanded they explain their beliefs under pressure. Others left the country and paid for that choice with distance and uncertainty. The draft also brought the war into communities that might otherwise have felt far away from foreign policy. It intensified protest because the stakes were not theoretical. They were names, birthdays, and empty chairs. It also intensified support among those who believed service was essential. Either way, the war entered private life. It turned national decisions into personal calendars. It made politics feel like fate. Tunnels under villages created invisible battlefields beneath ordinary homes. In parts of South Vietnam, the ground itself became a shelter, a supply route, and a command center. Tunnel systems were dug in layers, with tight turns and hidden entrances that could vanish beneath a cooking area or a patch of brush. Underground, people built meeting rooms, medical spaces, storage pits, and escape routes that led to unexpected exits. Living below ground demanded careful control of air, smoke, and noise. A single careless flame could betray an entire network. For opponents, the tunnels created a problem that felt almost supernatural. A firefight could end, then resume hours later because fighters had slipped away beneath your feet. Clearing tunnels was slow and terrifying work, often done by volunteers who crawled into darkness with limited light and no certainty about what waited ahead. These spaces changed the idea of a front line. The battlefield could be anywhere, including under the floor of an ordinary family home. Booby traps made simple footpaths feel like carefully set puzzles. In a landscape where visibility was limited and movement was constant, small devices could shape behavior more than large battles. Traps were designed to injure rather than kill, because a wounded soldier could halt a patrol and pull others into danger. Punji stakes hidden in pits punished the careless step. Tripwires could trigger grenades or improvised explosives. Some traps were built from scrap metal, bamboo, and captured ammunition, then disguised with leaves that looked completely natural. The psychological weight was enormous. A patrol might slow to a crawl, scanning for signs that could be real or imagined. Trust in the ground itself began to fade. That fear also changed decisions. Units might avoid certain routes, which made their movement more predictable elsewhere. The genius of many traps was not sophistication. It was placement and patience. A simple mechanism placed in the right place could control time, shape morale, and make every journey feel uncertain. Brown water Navy patrols fought a war of reeds, mud, and shadows. These crews operated in places where charts could be unreliable and visibility could collapse without warning. Patrol boats pushed through narrow canals that felt like corridors, with vegetation close enough to brush the hull. Crews listened for unusual splashes, watched for disturbed water, and tried to spot tripwires or mines that could be hidden just below the surface. They escorted supply convoys, searched vessels, and delivered troops into villages that might welcome them or fear them. Unlike deep ocean sailors, they lived in constant proximity to the shoreline, which meant the enemy was never far. The boats themselves were loud, and that noise could be a warning to anyone waiting. Yet the mission required persistence, because waterways were how people moved, traded, and survived. Every patrol was a test of patience and nerve. It was also a test of restraint, because one wrong judgment could turn a civilian crossing into a tragedy that echoed for years. The Vietnam War reshaped global politics and divided families on every side. It pulled the world into a struggle that rarely stayed on one map. Washington argued over credibility and containment, while Moscow and Beijing weighed influence and risk. In Vietnam, neighbors could end up on opposite sides, sometimes within the same village, sometimes within the same household. A young person might join the local militia. A sibling might work for an opposing administration. A parent might try to keep a family fed, while politics pressed in from every direction. Across oceans, the war split dinner tables and campuses, churches and unions, newsrooms and living rooms. Allies questioned one another. Governments fell, coalitions shifted, and the meaning of intervention changed. Long after the last major battles, the conflict still shaped diplomacy, migration, and memory. It became a lesson in how war can rewrite relationships as much as borders. Millions of civilians were caught between armies, ideologies, and shifting front lines. For many families, danger did not come with a uniform or a clear warning. One day might bring a patrol asking questions. Another day might bring a demand for food, labor, or silence. A quiet road could become a checkpoint. A market could become a target. People learned to read small signals and to keep plans flexible because alliances and control could change quickly. Some fled to cities that strained under sudden population surges. Some stayed and tried to make their homes invisible. Many carried the burden of impossible choices. Helping one side could invite punishment from the other. Refusing both could still bring suspicion. Even when battles ended, the aftermath lingered through displacement, missing relatives, and fields that could no longer be trusted. Civilian life became a kind of navigation. It was not about winning. It was about enduring and trying to keep the people you loved close enough to survive. Jungle terrain turned maps into guesses, and the trolls into tense listening. In dense vegetation, visibility can shrink to a few steps, and the world becomes sound first, sight second. A twig snap, a distant cough, the faint metallic click of gear can feel louder than gunfire. Monsoon rains erase tracks and swell streams, changing routes overnight. Heat and humidity drain energy, while insects and illness add a quiet second battle. For outsiders, even direction can feel uncertain under a canopy that hides the sun. Patrols moved slowly, scanning for signs that were easy to misread: a disturbed leaf, a fresh footprint, a cooking fire that vanished before it was seen. The landscape offered concealment and confusion to everyone, yet it favored those who lived with it daily. That is why small choices carried huge weight. Which path to take, where to halt, when to speak, when to wait. The jungle did not merely host the war. It shaped its tempo, its fear, and its surprises. US Marines dug in at Khe Sanh, expecting a decisive siege. High near the Laotian border, Khe Sanh became a place where strategy, symbolism, and fear converged. Marines occupied a remote base that seemed to invite a showdown, and commanders worried it could become another Dien Bien Phu. The surrounding hills offered positions for enemy artillery, while the base depended on air supply under constant threat. Trenches, bunkers, and sandbags, turned into a landscape of endurance. Artillery duels cracked the air, and patrols moved into terrain where any ridge could hide an ambush. Overhead, aircraft delivered supplies and firepower, and every landing felt like a gamble against shells and small arms. For many watching, Khe Sanh became a question. Would the United States hold, or would it be forced into a humiliating retreat? The siege expectation shaped decisions far beyond the base, tying huge resources to one lonely patch of ground that carried enormous psychological weight. Draft resistance grew from campuses, churches, and kitchen tables alike. Resistance did not look like one movement. It looked like thousands of private decisions made under pressure. Some people refused induction and faced prosecution. Some burned draft cards in public to make a moral statement. Others sought deferments, navigated complex rules, or argued for conscientious objector status. Families debated what courage meant. For some, it meant serving. For others, it meant refusing. Clergy offered sanctuary and counseling, while student groups organized marches and teach-ins that treated foreign policy like a civic emergency. There were also quieter forms of resistance, like deliberate failure of exams or the decision to disappear into informal networks. Canada became a destination for many who chose exile, and that choice carried its own loneliness and stigma. Draft resistance mattered because it turned the war into a daily question of identity and ethics. It also forced the United States to confront fairness, since race, class, and education shaped who was most likely to be called and who had the tools to bowel. Avoided. The Kent State shootings hardened protest and stunned the entire nation. In May 1970, protests erupted after the United States expanded combat into Cambodia. At Kent State University in Ohio, demonstrations grew tense over several days, with National Guard troops present and fear rising on both sides. On May 4th, guardsmen fired into a crowd of students, killing 4 and wounding 9. The image of young people shot on a campus lawn traveled fast and hit like a siren. It was not a battle zone. It was home. The shootings triggered strikes and protests at universities across the country, and they deepened a sense that the war was tearing the United States apart from within. The tragedy also became a permanent argument about authority, restraint, and escalation. People asked how a confrontation between citizens and the state could end in gunfire, and what that said about the health of democracy under stress. Kent State did not create anger, but it concentrated it into a single, unforgettable moment, and it made reconciliation feel farther away. Muhammad Ali's refusal made the war a moral question, not only policy. When Muhammad Ali refused induction into the United States Army, he did more than reject a personal obligation. He challenged the idea that national policy automatically outranked individual conscience. Ali cited religious conviction and opposition to the war, and he framed his stance with language that connected racism at home to violence abroad. The consequences were severe. He was convicted of draft evasion, stripped of his boxing title, and effectively barred from the sport during what could have been prime years of his career. Many Americans called him a coward. Many others saw rare courage because he accepted punishment rather than bend. Years later, the Supreme Court overturned his conviction, and public opinion shifted as the war grew more unpopular. Ali's refusal became a cultural landmark because it fused celebrity, faith, politics, and sacrifice into one story. It showed that dissent could come from someone with everything to lose, and that a single decision could echo far beyond the courtroom. In a conflict filled with official language, Ali spoke in personal moral terms, and millions listened. Conscientious objectors faced prison, exile, or lives reshaped by principle. claiming conscientious objector status demanded more than saying you opposed war. Applicants had to persuade boards that their beliefs were sincere and deeply held, often rooted in religion or a consistent moral framework. Hearings could feel like interrogations, with officials probing for contradictions and testing whether a young person sounded serious enough to deserve exemption. Some were denied and drafted anyway. Some refused and went to prison. Others accepted alternative service, working in hospitals, schools, or community programs that were framed as service to the nation without bearing arms. The path could split families. A parent might feel pride or shame, or both at once. Friends might stop speaking. For those who fled, exile meant starting over in a new country, while watching home become distant. Conscientious objection mattered because it exposed a tension at the heart of wartime citizenship. Does loyalty mean obedience, or does it sometimes mean refusal? These choices were not abstract philosophy. They were lived consequences that followed people for decades, shaping careers, relationships, and self-respect. Fragging incidents revealed strain, fear, and anger inside some units. As the war dragged on, morale problems emerged in certain corners of the American military, and one of the most alarming was fragging. The term referred to attacks on officers by their own troops, often using fragmentation grenades because they were hard to trace. These incidents were not the norm, yet their existence spoke volumes about breakdowns in trust. Some cases grew from fear of reckless leadership that seemed to treat lives as expendable. Others grew from resentment, exhaustion, or drug use, in a war where rotating tours could weaken cohesion. The very idea of fragging haunted commanders because it suggested the chain of command could fracture under pressure. It also revealed how counterinsurgency warfare could twist relationships. When danger feels constant and purpose feels unclear, anger looks for a target. Fragging became a dark signal that combat stress was not only directed at the enemy, it could turn inward. Even rumors of it could change leadership behavior, making some officers cautious and others harsher, which could deepen the cycle. Medevac helicopters made survival more likely and trauma more visible. A wounded soldier in earlier wars might wait hours for transport. In Vietnam, the whir of rotors often meant help was minutes away, if the landing zone could be secured. Medevac crews flew into chaos, guided by smoke, radio calls, and frantic gestures from the ground. Inside the aircraft, medics worked in a vibrating rush, holding pressure on wounds, checking breathing, and trying to keep someone alive until a hospital could take over. This speed changed survival rates and changed expectations. Soldiers fought knowing rescue was possible, which could affect morale and risk. It also made the costs impossible to hide. The helicopters carried not only bodies, but the raw reality of torn flesh, shock, and fear. Field hospitals became places of constant triage, where surgeons faced impossible choices with little rest. The Medevac system showed what modern logistics could do for saving lives. It also showed what modern war demands of the people who do the saving. Combat medics became lifelines, working miracles under fire and mud. They were trained to move toward the wounded when instinct says to move away. A medic might crawl through grass while bullets snapped overhead, reaching a friend whose name they had shouted in jokes an hour earlier. They carried bandages, morphine, plasma, and a calm voice that could steady someone slipping into panic. The work was intimate. It meant touching shattered limbs, clearing airways, and making quick decisions that could not be undone. Medics also faced a cruel math of time. They had to decide who could be saved first, even when every scream demanded attention. Many earned deep respect because they seemed to belong to everyone, regardless of rank or attitude. In a war filled with suspicion, medics were often trusted without question. Their courage was not only physical, it was emotional. They absorbed the pain of others and kept moving. The medic's role reveals a quieter heroism because it is built on care in the middle of destruction. Military engineers built bases fast, carving airstrips from jungle ground. War required more than rifles and patrols. It required roads that could handle trucks, runways that could land supplies, and fortifications that could hold under attack. Engineers arrived with heavy machinery and relentless schedules, transforming muddy clearings into functioning bases in astonishing time. They cut trees, leveled ground, and laid pierced steel planking to create airstrips where there had been only brush. They built bunkers, berms, and drainage systems because rain could destroy a position as surely as shells. In remote areas, construction itself could draw fire, which meant work crews sometimes built with weapons close at hand. Their efforts shaped where units could operate and how long they could stay. A base was not only a dot on a map. It was a promise of supply, medical support, communication, and shelter. Engineers made that promise real. Their story is a reminder that logistics is not background. It is the skeleton that holds a campaign upright. Prisoners of war endured isolation, propaganda, and long uncertainty. Captivity in Vietnam was not only about physical confinement. It was about time and the slow grinding of identity. Prisoners were cut off from reliable news, family contact, and the reassuring rhythm of ordinary life. Interrogations aimed to extract information, but they also aimed to reshape beliefs through pressure, rewards, and exhaustion. Some captors demanded statements for propaganda, hoping to use familiar faces as tools in a wider psychological war. The uncertainty was often the sharpest weapon. Not knowing when or if release would come could make each day feel endless. Prisoners developed small strategies to survive. They created routines, memorized poems, tapped codes to communicate, and held onto tiny marks of dignity such as posture, prayer, or humor. Bonds formed under these conditions could be intense because companionship became a lifeline. The POW experience also echoed after release, since reintegration meant adjusting to a world that had moved on without you. Their story reveals a quieter battlefield, fought in the mind and measured in endurance. The anti-war movement included many veterans, speaking with hard authority. When veterans spoke against the war, it landed differently. They were not guessing what combat felt like. They had lived the boredom, the fear, and the moral confusion, and they could describe it without romantic language. Groups such as Vietnam Veterans Against the War organized public testimony, marches, and moments of symbolic protest that challenged the idea that, quote, opposition was unpatriotic. Some veterans returned medals. Some described what they had seen in villages and on patrol. Their voices complicated the national argument because they carried both service and dissent in the same breath. This did not mean veterans agreed with each other. Many supported the war, and many felt accused by protest. Yet the presence of outspoken veterans expanded the conversation. It forced Americans to confront a hard question. If people who fought are warning you about the cost, what does loyalty require of those who stayed home? Their activism also showed that war does not end when a tour ends. It follows you into politics, conscience, and the search for meaning. Some soldiers returned to hostility, others to silence, many to confusion. Homecoming during the Vietnam era could feel like stepping into a country that had been arguing while you were gone. Some veterans met protest and anger. Others met polite avoidance, as if people feared the story they might tell. Many discovered that the language of daily life did not match what they carried inside. and that made conversation difficult. A supermarket aisle could feel too bright. A sudden noise could bring a body memory before the mind caught up. Friends who had stayed home might ask casual questions, then look away when the answers became heavy. Some veterans tried to speak and were dismissed. Some chose silence because silence felt safer. Confusion was common because the war itself was confusing, and returning did not tidy it up. Yet many also found paths toward rebuilding through family, work, education, and other veterans who understood without explanation. The complexity of return is part of the Vietnam War's legacy. It reveals that survival is not only about leaving a battlefield. It is also about learning how to live in ordinary time again. PTSD entered wider awareness partly through Vietnam's returning generation. Before Vietnam, many people understood war trauma through older labels like shell shock or battle fatigue, and those terms often implied weakness or temporary strain. After Vietnam, the sheer number of struggling veterans made it harder to look away. Nightmares, hypervigilance, and sudden panic were described by people who had no visible injuries, and families began to realize that coming home did not always mean coming back inside. Clinicians and advocates pushed for a clearer diagnosis that matched what veterans were living, not what society preferred to imagine. In time, post-traumatic stress disorder entered the formal medical language, and that recognition mattered because it opened doors to treatment, disability, support, and research. It also changed public vocabulary. A soldier could finally name what was happening, and naming can be the first step toward help. Vietnam did not invent trauma. It forced a modern society to admit it, measure it, and respond to it. The conflict accelerated debates about race, inequality, and service in America. Vietnam unfolded during a period when the United States was already fighting over civil rights, policing, housing, and who truly had access to crown. Opportunity. The war poured fuel on those arguments because service and sacrifice were not distributed evenly, and neither were deferments and protections. In some communities, the draft felt like yet another system that demanded obedience, while offering limited justice in return. In the military, daily life could reflect the same tensions found at home. Different backgrounds, different expectations, and different experiences of fairness collided under stress. The result was not one simple story. For some, the war became proof of loyalty and belonging. For others, it became proof that the nation asked most from those who had received the least. Protest movements and patriotic movements both drew energy from this friction, which made every debate sharper. Vietnam became a mirror held up to American society, showing divisions that had been there all along, then forcing people to argue about what citizenship really required. African American soldiers served in high numbers amid civil rights upheaval. Many African American servicemen fought in Vietnam while the struggle for civil rights was unfolding back home, which created a powerful and painful contrast. A soldier cooked the troll in a distant jungle, then read news about marches, assassinations, and unrest in the neighborhoods where their family lived. Some felt pride in service and skill, and some hoped that sacrifice would strengthen claims to equal respect. Others felt a bitter irony in being asked to risk everything for freedoms that were still contested at home. Inside units, racial tension could flare, especially as the war dragged on and morale frayed. Yet there were also bonds formed across lines that had seemed rigid before combat demanded trust. The experience varied widely, and that is part of its importance. Vietnam did not produce one uniform veteran story. For many African American veterans, it blended courage with contradiction, and it intensified the question of what the nation owed to those who served it. The Christmas bombing intensified air war and drew global condemnation. In December 1972, the United States carried out a concentrated series of bombing raids against targets in and around Hanoi and Haiphong, operation often called the Christmas bombing. The strikes were dramatic in scale and timing, occurring during a season associated with peace, which sharpened international reaction. Allies, neutral nations, and critics around the world condemned the raids, and the images of damage and civilian suffering fueled outrage. Supporters argued the campaign was intended to break an impasse and bring negotiations to a conclusion. Critics argued it was a brutal escalation that punished a population to gain leverage. Either way, the operation made air power feel like a blunt instrument held over diplomacy. It also tested the resilience of North Vietnam's defenses and civil infrastructure under intense pressure. The episode remains haunting because it compresses the war's contradictions into a single week. Political bargaining, moral argument, technological force, and human vulnerability, all colliding in cold winter nights. The Paris peace accords promised ceasefire, yet conflict resumed quickly. On paper, the agreement sounded like an exit ramp. There were signatures, formal language, and a promise that armed force would give way to politics. In reality, the war's machinery had too much momentum and too many unresolved aims to stop on command. Units on both sides tested boundaries, probed weak points, and responded to local clashes with larger actions. Each side also tried to position itself for whatever came next, which made restraint feel risky. A ceasefire without deep trust can become a tactical pause, and a tactical pause can be used to rebuild strength. For civilians, this was a cruel whiplash. Hopes rose with the headlines, then dropped when violence returned. The accords mattered historically because they ended direct American combat involvement in a formal sense, yet they did not settle the central question of who would govern a unified Vietnam. The fighting that followed showed how peace is more than an agreement. It is a balance that must be maintained, and it was not. The United States withdrew combat troops, ending a long direct involvement. The drawdown was not a single moment. It was a gradual unwinding of bases, units, and routines that had become enormous. Flights carried soldiers home, and the departures came with mixed emotions that could change hour to hour. Relief sat beside guilt. Pride sat beside bitterness. Some troops left behind friends' graves, unfinished missions, and a sense that the story did not have a clean ending. Commanders had to move equipment, close facilities, and hand responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces that were already strained. At home, families celebrated reunions while the country continued arguing about what the war had meant. The withdrawal changed the conflict's shape and its politics. It reduced American casualties, yet it also reduced leverage and direct control over events on the ground. For Vietnam, the fighting did not become smaller simply because fewer Americans were present. For the United States, the withdrawal became a national pivot, a recognition that limits had been reached. It also raised a question that lingered. When a great power steps back, what happens to the people who remain in the storm? North Vietnamese forces launched a final offensive, breaking southern defenses. In the war's last phase, the fighting moved with a speed that felt shocking after years of grinding stalemate. North Vietnamese commanders pushed coordinated advances that aimed not only to win battles, but to unravel the South's ability to respond. As pressure mounted, some defenses held briefly, then snapped under the strain of rapid retreats and collapsing confidence. Roads became clogged with civilians and military units moving at the same time, each step adding to the chaos. When a front breaks, the most dangerous moment is often the loss of coordination, because rumors travel faster than orders. Supplies run out. communication fails. Units that might have fought hard in isolation find themselves cut off or leaderless. The offensive succeeded partly because it exploited that cascading effect. It was not only a contest of firepower. It was a contest of momentum, morale, and timing. The South had been weakened by political instability, dependence on outside support, and internal pressures that war had magnified. When the final push came, the system could not absorb the shock. Saigon fell in April 1975, ending the Republic of Vietnam. In the final days, Saigon became a city holding its breath. Rumors spread through streets and offices, and every report of approaching forces tightened the sense of inevitability. Government officials faced choices that felt impossible, and many civilians faced the fear of what victory would mean for their families. As North Vietnamese troops moved in, the symbols of the old state began to dissolve, not only in buildings and flags, but in the sudden vanishing of authority. People who had depended on the Republic's protection found that protection gone. Others saw the moment as long-awaited liberation. The fall was both an ending and a beginning, and that duality is what makes it so powerful historically. A war that had involved global powers came down to a city's final hours, filled with hurried decisions and irreversible consequences. The date became a marker in memory worldwide. It closed the chapter of South Vietnam as a separate state, and it opened a new era of reunified rule that would reshape millions of lives. The evacuation by helicopter became an enduring image of hurried departure. Few scenes capture the feeling of a war ending badly, like a helicopter lifting off from a rooftop while people reach upward. The evacuation was the final act of a long entanglement, compressed into frantic hours. The challenge was logistical and human at once. Who gets a seat? Who is left behind? Which documents matter now, and which memories will follow you no matter what you carry? Helicopters shuttled people out under pressure, and each departure felt like both rescue and abandonment. The images traveled worldwide because they communicated a truth without explanation. Plans had collapsed into improvisation. Certainty had collapsed into escape. For many Vietnamese who had worked with Americans, the evacuation was a sharp line between safety and danger, and the line was not wide enough. For Americans watching later, the rooftop imagery became a symbol of limits and consequences, a reminder that powerful nations can still be forced into retreat. The helicopters did not only transport people, they transported a national mood, leaving behind a picture that still shapes how the war is remembered. The Tet Offensive shocked audiences, even where attacks failed militarily. During the Lunar New Year holiday, many expected a pause in fighting. Instead, coordinated attacks erupted across South Vietnam, striking cities and provincial centers with a scale that stunned both soldiers and civilians. Even where attackers were eventually pushed back, the surprise itself was the message. It exposed the reach and confidence of opposing forces, and it shattered claims that the war was nearing a tidy conclusion. In the United States, people watched scenes that did not fit official optimism. Streets that were supposed to be secure became battle zones. Embassies that symbolized authority were suddenly vulnerable. The offensive also revealed how war can be won and lost in perception as much as in territory. A military setback can still be a psychological victory if it changes what audiences believe is possible. Tet did that. It made the conflict feel larger, closer, and more uncertain, and it forced leaders and citizens alike to reconsider the path ahead. The conflict drew in superpowers, yet much fighting stayed intensely local. Global strategy often sounded enormous, yet the daily reality could be a single footbridge, a rice paddy, or a narrow street. A hamlet council might decide whether to share information, hide supplies, or keep silent. That choice could be shaped by fear, loyalty, family ties, or simple survival. Local fighters knew the shortcuts, the seasonal floods, and the places where sound carried at night. They could vanish into familiar terrain that outsiders struggled to read. Meanwhile, faraway capitals sent weapons, advisors, and promises that arrived with their own expectations. Two worlds overlapped. One was a competition of ideologies with speeches and treaties. The other was a ground-level contest over who could protect people, punish defiance, and persuade the uncertain. The war's intensity came from that collision because village decisions could ripple upward and superpower decisions could crush downward. Televised combat brought battlefield reality into living rooms like never before. For the first time, a distant war arrived with moving images that felt immediate and personal. Evening broadcasts could show wounded soldiers being carried, villages burning, and exhausted faces that did not match confident official language. The gap between statements and scenes created a new kind of pressure. Viewers began to feel like witnesses instead of spectators. Politicians faced questions that were sharper because citizens had seen the cost with their own eyes. Families recognized the uniforms, the equipment, and the fear. Journalists became central figures, shaping understanding through what they filmed and what they chose to explain. The war also changed media itself. Networks learned that images could drive public emotion faster than speeches. That power could inform, and it could distort. If it could not be ignored, in many homes, the conflict stopped being an abstract headline. It became a nightly presence, and it altered how people believed war should be judged. The war spread into Laos and Cambodia, often in secrecy. While headlines focused on Vietnam, the conflict's reach extended across borders in ways many people barely understood at the time. Supply routes, sanctuaries, and pursuit operations pulled neighboring countries into danger, even when their governments tried to stay afloat amid pressure. Bombing campaigns and ground incursions could be hidden behind vague language, classified briefings, or carefully managed public statements. That secrecy mattered because it limited debate, and it left civilians with few protections. Villages in border regions faced sudden destruction without any clear explanation of why their land had become part of a larger struggle. The spillover also destabilized politics. Leaders were forced to choose sides, or appear to choose sides, while armed groups gained space to grow. The result was a widening circle of suffering that did not respect national lines. It reminds us that wars rarely remain contained, even when maps suggest they should. A secret expansion can leave the deepest scars. Helicopters changed warfare, turning jungles into sudden landing zones. They made movement faster, and they made the battlefield feel like it could appear anywhere. Troops could be lifted over difficult terrain, dropped into clearings, and extracted under fire. That mobility reshaped climbing. Commanders could respond to reports more quickly and aim to surprise opponents who relied on foot travel. Yet the same machines that offered speed also brought vulnerability. A helicopter announced itself with sound long before it arrived, and it could become a bright target against green canopy. Pilots and door gunners faced danger on every approach. For soldiers on the ground, the rotors could mean rescue or sudden exposure, depending on what waited below. The helicopter became a symbol because it captured the war's contradictions. It showed modern technology meeting stubborn geography. It showed progress and peril in the same frame. It also altered the pace of combat. Instead of long marches, they could be abrupt contact, then a rush of chaos, then a lift back into the sky. Search and destroy strategies measured success by body counts, not territory. Instead of holding ground like a traditional frontline war, many operations focused on finding enemy units and reducing their ability to fight. That approach turned villages and forests into shifting hunting grounds. Large sweeps moved out from fire bases, often supported by helicopters and artillery, aiming to force contact and then apply overwhelming firepower. Success could be reported through casualty tallies and estimated enemy losses, numbers that traveled up the chain of command and fed public optimism. The problem was that war is not only arithmetic. A unit could suffer losses and still recruit locally. An area could be cleared and then quietly reoccupied after troops left. Civilians caught in the middle could lose homes and trust, which could create the very resentment the strategy hoped to avoid. The focus on attrition also created pressure to produce results, and pressure can warp judgment in dangerous ways. It was a strategy built for decisive metrics, yet the conflict kept refusing to stay measurable. The war's ending did not end its consequences. It began new chapters. When major fighting stopped, a different kind of struggle began. Families searched for missing relatives and tried to rebuild lives in cities and countryside that had been transformed. New political realities brought new rules, new institutions, and new tensions. Many people faced re-education, relocation, or sharp changes in work and status. Others fled, risking dangerous journeys because staying felt impossible. Abroad, veterans carried wounds that were not always visible, and societies argued over what the war had meant. The conflict left behind damaged landscapes, economic strain, and stories that did not fit neatly together. Memory became contested. Commemoration became complicated. Even international relationships shifted slowly, as former enemies weighed how to speak, trade, and move forward. The end of war is often described as a moment, yet it is more like a threshold. On the other side, the past still moves with you. It appears in families, in politics, in health, and in the quiet shape of everyday decisions. French defeat at Dien Bien Phu cracked open a new era in Indochina. In a remote valley in the northwestern highlands, France built a fortified base and expected superior firepower to control the region. The plan depended on air supply and the belief that the surrounding hills could not be effectively occupied. The Viet Minh turned that assumption inside out. They hauled artillery through rough country with extraordinary human labor, then hid the guns in carefully prepared positions. Trenches crept closer, day after day, until the garrison felt sealed inside a tightening ring. When the airstrip became unusable, supplies and morale both collapsed. The battle ended in a stunning surrender that shook Paris and electrified anti-colonial movements worldwide. It proved that a determined revolutionary army could defeat a European power on the ground. It also set the stage for a political settlement that would divide Vietnam and invite larger powers into the vacuum. The Geneva Accords split Vietnam temporarily and hardened rival governments. After years of war, diplomats met in Switzerland to design a way out, at least on paper. The agreements called for a ceasefire, a regrouping of forces, and a line near the 17th parallel that was meant to be provisional rather than permanent. Yet once people began moving, the separation became painfully real. Families chose sides or were forced into choices, sometimes with only what they could carry. The line became a demilitarized zone with heavy symbolism and growing tension. Planned nationwide elections were supposed to follow, but distrust and competing interests derailed that pathway. Two governments deepened their claims to legitimacy, each insisting the other was an imposter. Foreign backers increased support, turning a fragile pause into a sharper contest. The word temporary kept appearing, but the political reality was hardening. A division meant to buy time ended up buying momentum for a much larger war. Ho Chi Minh became both a national symbol and a global icon. He lived many lives before he became the face of a revolution. He worked abroad, absorbed socialist ideas, and spent years building networks that could survive arrests and crackdowns. During the Second World War, his movement fought Japanese occupation and sought allies wherever they could be found. In 1945, he stood in Hanoi and proclaimed independence, borrowing language that echoed famous democratic declarations to make a point to the air. World. To supporters, he was the voice of national dignity after long foreign rule. To opponents, he was a skilled strategist who wrapped communism in the language of liberation. Either way, his personal story became inseparable from Vietnam's modern identity. Portraits, slogans, and simple stories about his frugal habits carried enormous power. In global politics, his name became shorthand for anti-colonial struggle itself, inspiring admiration, fear, and intense debate far beyond. Southeast Asia. Ngo Dinh Diem's rule in the South sparked support and fierce opposition. He presented himself as a bulwark against communism and a builder of a new state, and he found important allies abroad who saw him as a necessary partner. Inside South Vietnam, his government pushed central control, promoted loyal networks, and sought to tame regional power brokers who had long operated independently. Some citizens welcomed the promise of order after years of turmoil. Others experienced the state as distant, suspicious, and heavy-handed. Political rivals were sidelined, critics were watched, and resentment grew in places where local traditions clashed with top-down rule. The gap between official confidence and everyday frustration widened. As rural insecurity increased, many villagers judged leaders by one question: who could keep their families safe tonight? Diem's supporters believed stability required firmness. His opponents believed firmness was turning into a trap. That tension mattered because it shaped recruitment, legitimacy, and the willingness of ordinary people to cooperate with one side or resist it. The National Liberation Front grew from politics, persuasion, and armed struggle. When the organization announced itself in the early 1960s, it presented a broad front rather than a single party. It spoke the language of nationalism, reform, and resistance, aiming to attract farmers, workers, students, and disillusioned officials. In many areas, influence spread through patient local work. Cadres held meetings, settled disputes, distributed messages, and offered protection that could feel more immediate than distant government promises. Armed actions were part of the picture, yet so were leaflets, symbols, and quiet pressure applied through community relationships. The movement understood that legitimacy is built in small moments. A fair decision in a village quarrel could matter as much as a firefight. It also understood fear. Refusing cooperation could bring consequences, and people knew it. The front's power came from weaving together ideology and daily life, so politics did not stay in speeches. It moved into fields, markets, and family conversations until neutrality became difficult to maintain. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became a vast supply web, not one path. Imagine a living network that could be rerouted like water when a river is blocked. Routes branched and rejoined through forests and mountains, often shifting with seasons, bombing, and surveillance. Supply teams built roads, repaired craters, disguised bridges, and moved everything from rice to ammunition with relentless discipline. At times, porters carried loads on their backs. At other times, trucks moved at night under blackout conditions, guided by experience and careful signals. The system depended on camouflage and redundancy. If one corridor was hit, another could open. Engineers laid fuel lines and built hidden depots, reducing the need for vulnerable convoys. Anti-aircraft defenses grew along key stretches, turning parts of the network into dangerous zones for attackers. The achievement was not speed, it was endurance. The network kept functioning under constant pressure, which meant southern battlefields could be sustained year after year. It showed how logistics can become a form of strategy and how persistence can rival technology. The Gulf of Tonkin incident widened war powers with lasting controversy. In early August of 1964, reports emerged of attacks on American destroyers operating in the Gulf of Tonkin. The first clash involved the USS Maddox and North Vietnamese boats, and it quickly became a major political moment. Days later, a second alleged attack was reported in bad weather and confusing conditions, and that report later became deeply disputed. In Washington, the events were framed as clear aggression that demanded a strong response. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the president broad authority to use military force without a formal declaration of war. That single vote shaped years of escalation. It became a symbol of how uncertain information can become a foundation for enormous decisions. The controversy did not fade because it touched something fundamental. What level of proof should be required before a nation commits to a widening conflict? The incident remains a warning about fog, urgency, and the seductive simplicity of a decisive narrative. Operation Rolling Thunder tested air power and revealed its limits. Beginning in 1965, the United States launched a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, with hopes that pressure from the air could change decisions on the ground. Targets were often chosen under political constraints, with long debates about escalation and the risk of provoking wider war. That meant bombers sometimes struck infrastructure, while key assets remained off-limits, or protected by timing and geography. North Vietnam adapted quickly. Air defenses improved, pilots faced sophisticated missiles, and valuable supplies were dispersed, repaired, or hidden. The campaign inflicted heavy damage and deep suffering, yet it did not deliver the intended strategic break. Instead, it became a contest of endurance. Each side tried to prove it could absorb pain longer than the other. The operation also exposed the problem of trying to signal resolve with explosions while expecting an opponent to interpret the signal as you intend. Bombing can destroy bridges and factories. It can also harden resolve, deepen hatred, and push a society into greater mobilization. The Battle of Aya Drang previewed helicopter warfare and brutal close combat. In 1965, in the Central Highlands near the Ia Drang River, American airmobile units met North Vietnamese regulars in fighting that felt like a new era arriving all at once. Helicopters could lift troops into remote landing zones, then return with reinforcements and ammunition, yet the same machines also created a métis, predictable rhythm that enemies could anticipate. One moment was the thump of rotors and shouted directions. The next was a wall of gunfire at very close range. Commanders learned how quickly an isolated landing zone could become a ring of danger. Soldiers learned that mobility did not guarantee control. It only changed how fast you could enter trouble. The battle produced hard lessons about fire support, coordination, and the terrifying speed of escalation. It also showed both sides that the war could be fought in sudden, concentrated bursts that left little time to think. The M16 rifle entered war early and faced serious reliability troubles. When the rifle first reached combat units, it carried a promise of modern design, lightweight, and rapid fire. Early experiences shattered that confidence. In humid conditions and heavy fighting, some rifles jammed at the worst possible moment, sometimes leaving a soldier with a weapon that could not be quickly cleared. Several problems collided. Ammunition changes increased fouling. Some rifles lacked chrome-lined chambers, which made extraction failures more likely. Cleaning supplies and training were not always provided with the urgency the situation demanded. Stories spread fast, especially the ones told after close calls. Over time, the weapon was improved, and procedures were tightened. Chrome lining became standard. Maintenance guidance became clearer. Yet the damage to trust lingered, because a soldier's relationship with a rifle is intimate. In combat, it is not a piece of equipment. It is a promise that must hold when everything else is uncertain. The early problems became a lesson about procurement, assumptions, and the cost of small oversights. Napalm became infamous, and its images scarred public memory worldwide. Incendiary weapons had existed for decades, yet in Vietnam, napalm became a word that carried immediate dread. It clung, it burned intensely, and it could turn a target area into a scene of sudden horror. Pilots used it to flush opponents from cover or to strike fortified positions, because fire could reach into spaces that bullets could not. The weapon's physical effects were only part of its power. The photographs and film that captured aftermath gave napalm a second life in public consciousness. People far from the war saw the cost in a way that could not be explained away with slogans. The images did not require technical knowledge. They required only empathy. That visibility changed debate because it forced a confrontation with what modern warfare could do to bodies and landscapes. Napalm became more than a tactical tool. It became a moral symbol, and symbols can reshape history as strongly as battles do. Agent Orange defoliation changed forests, farms, and human health for decades. To deny cover and disrupt supply, the United States sprayed large areas with herbicides, and Agent Orange became the most notorious. Aircraft and ground teams targeted forests and mangroves, stripping leaves from trees and exposing terrain that had offered concealment. The immediate goal was visibility and control, yet the longer story unfolded over years. Crops were damaged in some areas, which deepened hardship for rural families. Ecosystems were disrupted, and some landscapes struggled to recover their original diversity. The most painful legacy involved dioxin contamination, which has been linked to serious health problems. Veterans and Vietnamese civilians alike reported illnesses, birth defects, and long-term suffering that did not end when fighting stopped. The controversy also reshaped how people think about wartime chemicals. It raised questions about responsibility, evidence, and care for those harmed. The war did not only break buildings and bodies. It also altered biology, and biology remembers. Strategic hamlets tried to separate villagers from insurgents, with mixed results. The plan sounded straightforward. Move rural families into fortified settlements, provide security, and cut insurgents off from food, recruits, and information. In practice, it collided with tradition and trust. Many villagers had lived on ancestral land, tended specific fields, and relied on local networks for survival. Relocation could feel like uprooting a life rather than improving safety. Construction often happened fast, sometimes with poor materials and uneven protection. If security forces could not reliably defend a hamlet, the barriers became a symbol of vulnerability instead of strength. Insurgents also adapted. They threatened collaborators, infiltrated at night, and turned resentment into opportunity. In some places, the program worked better. In others, it backfired by making people feel controlled rather than protected. The deeper lesson was that security is not only walls and watchtowers, it is legitimacy. If a community does not believe a government understands their life, even well-funded programs can become recruitment posters for the other side. The Buddhist crisis exposed deep fractures inside South Vietnamese politics. In 1963, religious tension in South Vietnam erupted into a national crisis that the world could not ignore. Disputes over flags, public worship, and government favoritism grew into mass protests led by Buddhist communities. Then came an image that stunned observers. The monk Thich Quang Duc sat in a Saigon street and set himself on fire as an act of protest. The photograph spread globally and made the government's reassurances sound hollow. The crisis was not only about religion. It revealed a deeper problem of credibility, because many citizens felt unheard and mistreated by a state that claimed to represent them. Repression deepened anger instead of calming it. International support began to wobble as allies questioned stability and judgment. The moment mattered because it showed how quickly legitimacy can collapse when public symbols and private grievances collide. A government can survive military pressure for a long time. It struggles when its own people no longer believe its promises. A coup removed Diem, and instability surged in the south afterward. In late 1963, South Vietnamese military officers moved against President Ngo Dinh Diem, and the result was swift and irreversible. He was overthrown and killed, and the political structure that had centered on his rule cracked apart. The change was meant to clear the way for stronger leadership, yet it opened a revolving door. Juntas rose and fell. Rival generals maneuvered. Civilian governance remained fragile, and ministries struggled to project consistent authority beyond major cities. That instability mattered on the ground, because war is also administration. It is pay, logistics, justice, and confidence that someone is in charge tomorrow. When leadership changes repeatedly, local officials hedge their bets. Soldiers wonder what they are fighting for. Allies argue over who speaks for the state. Insurgent networks thrive in that uncertainty because confusion is fertile ground for infiltration and persuasion. The coup was a turning point, not only because it removed a leader. It removed a sense of permanence, and the war exploited that vacuum. The Viet Cong relied on patience, local knowledge, and layered concealment. Many insurgent forces avoided set-piece battles because time could be a weapon if you could survive long enough to use it. Fighters blended into villages where they had friends, relatives, and histories that outsiders could not easily read. They built influence through small acts that looked like community work and through intimidation that rarely left clear fingerprints. Organization often had layers. Local guerrillas handled familiar ground. Regional units struck when conditions were favorable. Political operatives gathered information, enforced discipline, and shaped opinion with careful messaging. The goal was not constant victory. It was steady pressure that exhausted opponents and eroded confidence. A road could be safe for months, then suddenly deadly. A village could seem neutral, then reveal hidden loyalties. That unpredictability made the war feel endless, because progress was hard to measure and easier to exaggerate. Patience also shaped recruitment. A person might resist at first, then join after a single loss, a single threat, or a single promise of belonging. In a long war, those small turns accumulate. Riverine warfare turned the Mekong Delta into a maze of ambushes. The Mekong Delta is a world of water, where rivers split into smaller channels, then split again, until land and water trade places every few steps. Fighting there meant learning to think like the current. Boats became patrol cars, supply trucks, and lifelines. A bend in a canal could hide a waiting squad. A line of palms could conceal a firing position that vanished the moment shots were fired. Combat happened close, often within shouting distance, with mud sucking at boots and reeds hiding movement. Control was fragile, because a waterway that looked secure at noon could be hostile by nightfall. Civilians still worked the delta, which made every encounter morally complicated and tactically uncertain. Riverine warfare also blurred the idea of a front line. The front could be a boat's bow cutting through brown water, while danger waited in silence on both banks. Hugh saw fierce street fighting, showing war could be urban and intimate. Hue was an ancient city with deep cultural meaning, and during Tet it became the site of grinding combat that unfolded house by house. Urban fighting changed everything. There was no distant horizon. Danger came from windows, courtyards, and narrow alleys where sightlines were short and decisions were immediate. Soldiers navigated walls and rubble, often unsure which buildings were occupied and which were traps. Artillery and air support carried a terrible trade-off. They could save lives in the moment, yet they could also damage historic structures and harm civilians who had nowhere to flee. Hugh demonstrated that the war was not only jungle patrols and rural hamlets. It could seize a city and turn daily life into a battlefield of stairs and doorways. The fighting also carried a heavy political shadow because control of a symbolic place sent a message about legitimacy. When the city was retaken, the scars remained in brick, stone, and memory. Tet shifted public trust, widening the credibility gap in the United States. Before Tet, many Americans had been told the war was being steadily brought under control. Tet made that narrative feel fragile, even for people who still supported the mission. The issue was not only what happened on the ground, it was what people believed they had been told, and what they were now seeing. When officials spoke of progress, audiences remembered the sudden scale of the attacks and wondered what else had been misjudged. That doubt spread into questions about casualty reporting, strategy, and the very definition of success. The phrase credibility gap captured the feeling that there was a space between public reassurance and private reality. Once that space opens, it tends to expand. It influences elections, protest movements, and personal choices about service. It also influences soldiers and families who need honesty more than optimism. Tet did not create skepticism from nothing. It gave skepticism a sharp focus, and it made trust a central battleground. Walter Cronkite's doubt symbolized a broader change in national mood. Cronkite was not simply a broadcaster. To many viewers, he felt like a steady voice in a turbulent decade, someone whose tone suggested careful judgment rather than excitement. After visiting Vietnam in the wake of Tet, he offered an assessment that was widely interpreted as a turning point because it expressed uncertainty about a clear path to beyond bar. Victory. The significance was not that one man changed history with one broadcast. The significance was that his words matched what many people were already beginning to feel. When a trusted mainstream figure echoed doubt, it signaled that skepticism had moved beyond fringe corners into the center of public life. That shift mattered because political leaders depend on shared assumptions to sustain long wars. Once those assumptions fracture, every policy announcement meets a harder question. What is the plan, and what is the truth? Cronkite became a symbol of that moment, when the nation's emotional weather changed. After that, the war was argued not only in Congress or on campuses, but in millions of quiet living rooms. Vietnamization aimed to hand off combat while pulling American troops home. As the United States searched for a way out that would not look like defeat, the strategy turned toward building up South Vietnamese forces while reducing American ground involvement. It was a high-wire act. Troop withdrawals satisfied domestic pressure, yet they also risked weakening battlefield strength before local forces were ready. Training expanded, equipment flowed, and South Vietnamese units were asked to take on more complex missions. At the same time, American air power and advisors remained crucial, which created a dependency that was hard to break cleanly. The policy also carried a political message. It tried to promise peace with honor, even as fighting continued. For soldiers and civilians in the South, the transition could feel like a test that arrived faster than confidence. For the North, it was a signal to wait and probe for weakness. Vietnamization reveals a central tension in many wars. Leaving is not one decision. It is a chain of decisions, each one affecting morale, capacity, and the willingness of allies to keep believing. Our then forces carried heavier burdens under intense pressure and scrutiny. South Vietnamese soldiers were often fighting for their own towns and families, yet they were also judged through a harsh lens that did not always reflect their reality. They faced determined opponents, difficult terrain, and the challenge of sustaining units in a war that rewarded patience and punished mistakes. Leadership quality varied as it does in any army, and politics sometimes interfered with promotions and strategy. Still, many ARVN units fought bravely in fierce battles, absorbing losses that rarely dominated foreign headlines. Their burden grew as American troops withdrew, because they were expected to prove they could hold the line while the world watched. That scrutiny created pressure that could be unfair, yet it was also unavoidable, because the entire strategy hinged on their performance. For many soldiers, the war was not a debate. It was a daily obligation with real consequences for their families. Understanding their role means seeing the conflict not only as an American story, but as a Vietnamese one, filled with duty, fear, and perseverance. The Phoenix program targeted insurgent networks and remains fiercely debated. Rather than focusing only on battlefield units, this effort aimed to disrupt the political and logistical infrastructure that allowed insurgency to function. Intelligence gathering, informants, and raids were used to identify cadres, couriers, and local organizers who operated in the shadows. Supporters argued it was necessary because insurgent influence was rooted in hidden systems that could not be defeated by conventional sweeps alone. Critics argued it encouraged abuses, wrongful detention, and killings, because intelligence in a war zone can be flawed and easily manipulated by personal grudges. The program became controversial because it sat at the intersection of security and morality. It asked how far a state should go to break an underground movement, and what happens when secrecy and urgency become routine. The debate still matters because similar dilemmas appear in later conflicts around the world. Phoenix is a reminder that counterinsurgency is not only tactics. It is also trust, accountability, and the human cost of operating in the grey areas of war. My lie revealed atrocities and forced painful questions about command and culture. In March 1968, American soldiers entered the hamlet of My Lai during a search operation in Quang Tri province. What followed was the killing of unarmed civilians on a shocking scale, including women, children, and older people. The horror was not only the violence itself. It was the way ordinary military routines, stress, dehumanization, and confused orders could slide into catastrophe. A helicopter crew led by Hugh Thompson Jr. intervened, placing their aircraft between civilians and advancing troops, then evacuating some survivors. When the truth began to surface, it shattered comforting stories about clean warfare and perfect discipline. It forced the public to ask what training, leadership, and accountability really meant in a war fought among villagers. My Lai became a moral turning point, because it showed how quickly a unit's sense of purpose can corrode and how hard it can be to stop once it starts. The massacre's exposure came through persistence, leaks, and relentless reporting. For more than a year, what happened at My Lai stayed buried behind paperwork, silence, and the natural impulse to protect comrades and careers. Then a former soldier, Ron Riedenaar, began writing detailed letters to members of Congress, the Pentagon, and journalists. He was not an investigator with authority. He was simply someone who could not let the story die. His push helped set official inquiries in motion. Reporters kept digging, and Seymour Hersh eventually broke the story to a wide audience, while photographs by Army photographer Rommel Heberly gave the public Quandi, images that were impossible to dismiss. The chain of exposure mattered because it showed how truth can surface in wartime. It rarely arrives through a single heroic act. It arrives through stubborn steps, careful interviews, and documents that do not match the official tone. The My Lai story became a case study in why whistleblowing is risky, why institutions resist shame, and why journalism can change history. The Pentagon Papers showed long patterns of doubt inside leadership circles. In the early 1970s, a classified study of United States decision-making in Vietnam was leaked, and it revealed a private world that contrasted more sharply with public confidence. The documents showed leaders wrestling with uncertainty, weighing political costs, and recognizing obstacles that were rarely acknowledged in speeches. The shock was not that policymakers made mistakes. The shock was how often they seemed to know the risks, then moved forward anyway. Daniel Ellsberg helped bring the papers to the press, and major newspapers published them despite intense government pressure. A dramatic legal battle followed, reaching the Supreme Court and becoming a landmark moment for press freedom. For many citizens, the papers did something deeper than provide new details. They changed the emotional relationship between government and the governed. People began to wonder how many other wars were narrated with optimistic language, while private memos told a darker story. The Pentagon Papers became a lesson about secrecy, credibility, and the cost of governing by narrative instead of candor. USO shows tried to lift spirits, even near the sound of mortars. While battles dominated headlines, a parallel effort aimed to keep soldiers connected to the idea of home. USO tours brought entertainers into Vietnam, sometimes to big bases with makeshift stages, sometimes to remote spots where the audience sat on sandbags. The contrast could be surreal. Laughter and applause rose against a background of heat, fatigue, and distant explosions. For a brief hour, a comedian's timing or a singer's familiar tune could make a room feel human again. These shows were also risky. Travel routes were dangerous, and performers sometimes found themselves close to incoming fire. Yet many kept going because they believed morale mattered as much as supplies. The impact was not simple. Some troops felt comforted. Some felt homesick. Some felt forgotten the moment the curtain fell. Even so, the tours reveal something tender inside a brutal war. In the middle of violence, people still reached for normalcy, for shared jokes, for a reminder that their names existed beyond a uniform. The war fed new music, from protest anthems to soldier ballads. Vietnam did not only produce speeches and headlines, it produced a soundtrack of argument and emotion. In the United States, musicians wrote songs that questioned authority, mourned losses, and captured the confusion of a generation watching friends disappear into beer. Service. Those songs became portable protests, played at rallies and in bedrooms, turning private fear into shared language. At the same time, soldiers carried their own music. Radios on bases played rock, soul, and country, and the same chorus could mean different things depending on who heard it. For some, a love song was a lifeline. For others, a bitter lyric voiced what could not be said to an officer. In Vietnam, music also carried memory and identity, shaping how people remembered the conflict long after it ended. The key is that music made the war feel immediate. It offered a way to speak about grief, anger, and longing without a policy briefing. Long after dates blur, melodies remain. They keep emotional history alive, and they can turn a distant era into a pulse you can still feel. Journalists in Saigon chased briefings, rumors, and hard truth in heat. Saigon became a strange newsroom on the edge of a war, where reporters lived close to danger, but also close to the machinery of spin. Days began with tips whispered in hotel lobbies, scraps of radio chatter, and calls from fixers who seemed to know everything 5 minutes early. Then came the scramble. A helicopter seat might be offered, then vanish. A convoy might be announced, then cancelled. Journalists learned to read between lines and to compare what officials claimed with what witnesses described in the same afternoon. The city's rhythms shaped the reporting. There were deadlines, drinks, curfews, and sudden bursts of breaking news that sent everyone running to phones and telex machines. Some correspondents became famous. Others stayed anonymous, yet they still shaped how millions understood the war. Saigon taught them a hard skill. In conflict, truth often arrives in fragments, and you have to earn each one. The phrase, 5 o'clock follies, mocked optimistic daily military briefings. Every afternoon, reporters gathered for official updates that often sounded upbeat, orderly, and reassuring. The problem was that many journalists had seen the field, spoken to soldiers, or compared casualty claims with what local sources were saying. When the briefing tone stayed relentlessly confident, it began to feel like theatre. The nickname came from that tension. It was a way of saying the performance mattered more than accuracy. Officers used charts, language about progress, and carefully chosen details meant to project control. Reporters responded with skeptical questions, knowing their readers were losing patience with polished reassurance. The briefings became a daily ritual where trust eroded in public. Even when an official tried to be honest, the setting carried suspicion, because the system had trained everyone to expect selective truth. The phrase stuck because it captured a pattern, not a single lie. It suggested that information itself had become a battlefield, and that morale was being managed like a weapon. Body bag counts became grim statistics and never captured human loss. Numbers can feel clean, and war is never clean. As the conflict continued, casualty figures were often presented as measures of momentum, as if higher enemy losses automatically meant the end was nearer. Those tallies were discussed in briefings and reports, and they sometimes became a substitute for clarity about aims and outcomes. Yet each number hid a face, a language, a hometown, and a family that would never be the same. It also hid the unevenness of suffering. A single firefight might devastate one unit, while another saw months of tense waiting. Civilian deaths were often harder to count and easier to ignore, which bent the moral picture even further. The focus on counts could also distort behavior, because people under pressure to show results start counting what they can count. In the end, the figures never explained what was being won, what was being lost, or what could not be repaired. Seabees and construction battalions shaped logistics, not just headlines. The naval construction battalions, known as Seabees, brought a builder's mindset into a combat zone where time mattered as much as courage. They repaired ports so ships could unload faster. They improved roads so convoys could keep moving. They built schools, clinics, and wells in some areas, which added a complicated civic layer to a war that was never only military. Their motto, "We build, we fight," reflected the strange reality that a hammer and a rifle could both be necessary in the same hour. Seabees often worked in harsh conditions, racing monsoon damage and working around shortages. They faced danger too, because construction sites are predictable targets, and heavy equipment cannot sprint for cover. Their impact was often invisible to distant audiences, yet it was decisive on the ground. A runway extension could mean more supplies arriving. A repaired bridge could mean a unit escaping an ambush route. Their work shows how wars are sustained by people who rarely appear in dramatic footage, even though everything depends on them. The CHI, l'État va, entre non da, idea framed war as people's resistance. This concept, often translated as people's war, treated conflict as something larger than armies meeting on a battlefield. It argued that political will, local support, and everyday participation could be as powerful as artillery. Under this view, villages were not just places to pass through. They were sources of intelligence, food, recruits, and legitimacy. The aim was to stretch an opponent, not by one decisive clash, but through constant pressure that made the war feel everywhere at once. That meant building networks, sustaining morale, and treating time as an ally. It also meant that the lines between civilian life and military effort could blur in dangerous ways, because coercion and persuasion could sit side by side. The concept helps explain why modern equipment alone could not guarantee success. An army can win battles and still lose the surrounding struggle for influence and endurance. The idea reframed victory as something measured in resilience and collective commitment, which made the conflict harder to end cleanly. Cadres organized villages quietly, turning politics into daily routines. In many rural areas, power did not arrive as a grand speech. It arrived as someone who knew your family, asked about your crops, and offered to solve a dispute. Cadres worked through relationships. They held small meetings, collected donations, distributed instructions, and identified who could be persuaded, who could be pressured, and who needed watching. They helped establish shadow governance in places where official control was thin, creating systems that could collect information and enforce decisions. This organization could feel protective to some people and terrifying to others. It depended on knowing the social fabric, which meant understanding who owed favors, who held grudges, and who carried influence. That knowledge made the cadre system difficult to uproot with conventional force. You can destroy a building, yet you cannot easily destroy a network of obligations and quiet loyalties. Their presence also changed everyday life. Politics became something you navigated while buying rice, while attending a wedding, and while deciding what to say to a stranger at dusk. Women served as fighters, medics, couriers, and indispensable organizers. The war demanded total effort, and women stepped into roles that were essential across many regions and factions. Some carried weapons and fought in combat units. Others moved messages, supplies, and intelligence through checkpoints and along back paths, often by appearing ordinary in a world that underestimated them. Many served as medics, treating wounds in makeshift clinics or in hidden shelters where resources were scarce. Women also kept communities functioning under pressure, maintaining food production, caring for children, and holding families together during long absences. Their work was not only supportive, it was strategic. A courier who delivered information on time could change an operation's outcome. An organizer who sustained morale could keep a community from collapsing into fear. After the war, many women carried invisible scars, along with pride and complicated memories. Their stories widen the lens. They remind us that war is not only the story of frontline firefights. It is also the story of who keeps the system running, who holds knowledge, and who bears the burden when normal life disappears. The war's supply effort depended on bicycles, porters, and extraordinary endurance. Along jungle tracks and mountain passes, logistics became a contest of lungs and legs. Men and women pushed reinforced bicycles loaded far beyond what a city rider would believe possible, sometimes guiding them with one hand while steadying the bow below, cargo with the other. When wheels could not go farther, loads shifted to shoulders and backs, and the trail kept moving anyway. Supply teams timed movement to weather, darkness, and patrol patterns, then repaired damage quickly when routes were cratered or blocked. The genius was not glamour. It was persistence, planning, and a stubborn refusal to let the system stop. These human-powered methods were harder to detect than large convoys, and they could be restarted again and again after attacks. In a war where modern technology grabbed attention, this quieter engine mattered every day. It reminds you that strategy can hinge on something as simple as a tire, a strap, and the will to keep walking. Anti-aircraft guns along trails created deadly corridors for low aircraft. As air attacks intensified, defenders adapted with layered fire that turned certain stretches of sky into traps. Anti-aircraft crews hid guns under camouflage and placed them to cover key choke points, such as river crossings and valley approaches. Pilots flying low to spot movement or strike targets faced a nightmare. A burst of fire could appear from nowhere, then vanish as crews shifted positions or blended back into foliage. The effect went beyond losses. It shaped behavior. Aircraft had to change routes, altitudes, and timing, which reduced accuracy and increased risk during rescue missions and supply drops. It also forced planners to spend more resources on suppression, escort, and intelligence, just to keep the same pressure on the ground. The sky did not belong to one side. It was contested with patience and practice. Along the trail networks, anti-aircraft guns became guardians of flow, protecting the lifelines that sustained the fight and punishing anyone who tried to watch too closely. B-52 strikes could flatten wide areas, yet miss hidden fighters. The B-52 was built for the nuclear age, yet in Vietnam, it became a symbol of overwhelming conventional force. When a strike was called, the ground could tremble, and the air could feel as if it had weight. Bombs fell in patterns designed to crush large areas, and the scale was almost hard to imagine until you stand where the trees have been snapped and the earth is torn. Open. These raids could break assaults, shatter supply dumps, and leave craters that looked like a new landscape. Yet opponents learned to survive by dispersing, digging, and moving. A unit could melt away, then return when the aircraft were gone. That mismatch created frustration. Enormous power did not automatically deliver decisive results, especially against a force built around concealment and endurance. The B-52 story is a lesson in the limits of magnitude. Even the loudest thunder can pass over a hidden path without seeing it. Operation Ranch Hand sprayed chemicals from aircraft, reshaping whole landscapes. This program used aircraft to spray herbicides over forests and cropland, with the goal of stripping cover and exposing movement. The missions were systematic. Planes flew low and steady, releasing wide curtains of mist along mapped routes, often with protective escorts because the aircraft were vulnerable. Crews had a grim joke: only you can prevent forests, which captured how routine the flights became. Barrels were marked with colored bands, and one combination later became infamous. Yet the operation included multiple chemical mixtures and repeated applications over the same regions. The immediate effects could be startling. Green canopy thinned, mangroves turned skeletal, and familiar pathways suddenly felt exposed to surveillance and attack. The longer effects were harder to predict, and they varied by place and season. Ranch Hand shows how war can treat ecology as an obstacle to be removed, and how quickly a landscape can become part of the strategy itself. Combat photographers captured split seconds that later defined the era. Some of the most lasting memories of the Vietnam War were made by people carrying cameras instead of rifles. They moved with patrols, climbed into helicopters, and stood near civilians whose faces revealed fear, exhaustion, or sudden grief. A photographer had to anticipate the moment, then choose what to frame and what to leave out. That choice could shape history. Images by people like Larry Burroughs and Eddie Adams did not merely illustrate articles. They created symbols that traveled farther than any unit, reaching audiences who had never heard a mortar or smelled smoke. The danger was real. Photographers were wounded and killed, and their work was often made under the same fire as the soldiers beside them. The ethical weight was real too. When do you lift the camera, and when do you lower it? The photos that endured did not do so because they were beautiful. They endured because they made distant events feel immediate, and they forced viewers to confront the human cost in a single breath. The Napalm Girl photo became a global symbol of civilian suffering. In June 1972, photographer Nick UT captured a scene on a road near Trang Bang that stopped the world. Children were running from an air attack, and at the center was a young girl, Phan Thi Kim Phuc, burned and screaming in pain. The photograph carried a terrible clarity. It did not require context to hurt, and it did not allow easy excuses. Newspapers printed it, televisions discussed it, and the image became a shorthand for what civilians endure when war reaches into ordinary life. It also helped in the moment, getting the children to medical care, which reminds us that witnessing and responsibility can collide in real time. The girl survived and later became a voice for peace, but the photograph never lost its sting. Its power lies in its simplicity. A child's suffering can puncture strategy, speeches, and distance, and make the moral question unavoidable. The Hanoi Hilton became shorthand for captivity, survival, and controversy. H. de Letzief, a low prison in Hanoi, was originally built under French colonial rule. Yet during the war, it became the most famous detention site SAR. For American aviators, prisoners called it the Hanoi Hilton with bitter humor, a way to reclaim control over a place designed to strip it away. Conditions varied over time and among captives, and accounts have been argued over for decades, which is part of why it remains so charged. What is certain is that prisoners faced isolation, interrogation, and the constant pressure of being used as political symbols. Some became public figures after release, telling stories that shaped how Americans understood the war and its aftermath. The prison's fame also shows how a single location can become mythic, representing an entire category of experience. When people say Hanoi Hilton, they rarely mean just a building. They mean a test of will, a struggle over narrative, and a reminder that wars are fought not only with weapons, but with stories about suffering and resilience. The Montagnard peoples faced pressure from all sides in the highlands. In Vietnam's Central Highlands, Montagnard communities lived in territories that became strategically vital, and that attention brought danger as much as it brought alliances. Their distinct cultures and languages set them apart from lowland Vietnamese society, and wartime politics often treated them as pieces on a board rather than as people with their own priorities. Some Montagnards aligned with South Vietnamese forces and American Special Forces, serving as scouts and fighters who knew the terrain intimately. That partnership offered weapons and support, but it also made them targets for retaliation. They could be pressured by insurgents, distrusted by officials, and caught in shifting lines of control. After major phases of the war, many faced harsh consequences, displacement, and a difficult struggle for recognition and safety. Their story is a reminder that conflicts do not only pit armies against each other, they also squeeze minority communities who are trying to protect home, identity, and survival, while larger powers fight over their land. Religious groups in Vietnam navigated loyalty, fear, and survival choices. Vietnam's religious landscape was diverse, and wartime stress turned faith communities into places of refuge, suspicion, and political meaning. Buddhists, Catholics, Cao Dai, Hoa Hao, and other groups often had local influence through temples, churches, and networks of charity that reached into daily life. That influence could attract pressure. Authorities might demand public support. Insurgent groups might demand cooperation, silence, or resources. Ordinary believers faced hard questions about what it meant to protect neighbors without inviting danger. Clergy sometimes acted as mediators, sometimes as activists, and sometimes as targets. Even choosing to hold a ceremony could carry risk if the wrong people interpreted it as a signal of loyalty. These tensions played out differently from region to region, which made simple headlines misleading. The deeper truth is that war invades conscience. It turns faith into a balancing act between spiritual duty and physical safety, and it forces communities to make choices that can be judged harshly later by people who never faced the same midnight knocks at the door. The Paris peace talks dragged on, while fighting continued relentlessly. The talks began in Paris in 1968, and they became a strange parallel war fought with microphones, schedules, and symbolic gestures. Delegations argued over procedure and legitimacy, while soldiers continued to die thousands of miles away. Progress was slow because each side feared that compromise would be read as weakness, and each side believed time might improve its position. The talks also had multiple layers, with public sessions designed for messages and private contacts aimed at real bargaining. Meanwhile, military operations continued in Vietnam, and each new battle could shift the atmosphere at the table. Families watched headlines for hints, learning to interpret diplomatic language like weather forecasts. The endurance of the talks became part of the story because it revealed how hard it is to end a conflict once it has become tied to national identity, international prestige. Peace negotiations are often imagined as a doorway out. In Paris, the doorway kept moving, and people kept reaching for it anyway. Negotiations included walkouts, delays, and symbolism down to table shapes. In high-stakes diplomacy, even furniture can become politics. The shape of the table in Paris became contentious because it signaled who counted as a legitimate party, and legitimacy was one of the core battles. A rectangular arrangement could imply hierarchy. A round arrangement could imply equality. Even the number of sides at the table mattered, since recognition of a delegation could strengthen its claim to represent the future of Vietnam. Walkouts and delays were not only tantrums. They were tactics designed to pressure opponents, to appeal to public opinion, and to avoid concessions that could be portrayed as surrender. Diplomats performed patience while measuring every word, knowing it would be read by enemies, allies, and voters. The theater could feel absurd, yet the stakes were deadly serious. When you cannot agree on who is allowed to speak, you are really arguing about who is allowed to win. The table debate became a miniature version of the war itself, a struggle over authority disguised as protocol. Henry Kissinger and Leduc, though, shared a Nobel Peace Prize controversially. In 1973, Henry Kissinger and Leduc, though, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the Paris Peace Accords. The award landed like a lightning strike because the fighting and suffering were not truly over, and many people saw the agreement as a pause rather than a lasting settlement. The controversy deepened when Leduc, though, declined the prize, saying peace had not been achieved. That refusal made the moment even more memorable, since it turned the spotlight onto the gap between diplomatic paperwork and lived reality. Within the Nobel institution, the decision sparked intense criticism, and some members resigned in protest. For supporters, the prize recognized a difficult step toward ending American involvement. For critics, it seemed to celebrate negotiation while violence continued. The episode shows how symbols can misfire when they outrun events. A prize meant to honor peace instead became a lesson about timing, optics, and the uncomfortable truth that agreements can be signed while wars remain unfinished. Operation Linebacker used heavy bombing to pressure negotiations in the north. In 1972, the United States launched Operation Linebacker, a major bombing campaign aimed at disrupting North Vietnam's ability to wage AT. War and increasing pressure at the negotiating table. Unlike earlier efforts, this campaign involved striking a wider set of targets and emphasized interdicting supplies and transportation. It unfolded alongside mining operations that restricted shipping, creating a broader squeeze on logistics and mobility. The message was meant to be unmistakable. Escalation could return, and it could be intense. For those planning it, the hope was that military force could shape political decisions more directly than before. For those living under it, it was another period of fear, destruction, and dislocation. Linebacker remains debated because it sits at the heart of a difficult question. Can bombing accelerate peace, or does it deepen hatred while postponing compromise? The campaign did contribute to a shift in the negotiating environment, but it also intensified the war's human cost in the process. It is one of the clearest examples of diplomacy being pursued with explosives. Re-education camps reshaped lives, families, and futures after the war. After reunification, many people associated with the former South Vietnamese government, military, or institutions were sent to re-education camps. The term sounded administrative, yet the experience could be harsh and deeply disorienting. People were separated from families, held for uncertain periods, and subjected to political instruction alongside forced labor. The uncertainty alone was a form of pressure. A person might not know when or if release would come, which made each day feel suspended. Families on the outside faced economic hardship, social stigma, and the emotional toll of waiting. The camps also affected Vietnam's professional and civic life because engineers, teachers, officials, and soldiers were removed from their communities for long gros pas stretches. For some, the camps became a turning point that shaped decisions to flee the country later. For others, survival meant adapting and rebuilding within the new system. The re-education experience remains a sensitive and contested memory, yet it is central to understanding how war's aftermath can be punitive as well as political. Peace did not simply arrive. It arrived with new rules, and those rules had teeth. Boat people fled across dangerous seas, creating a major refugee crisis. When life after the war felt unsafe or hopeless, many Vietnamese chose a desperate route. They left by sea in crowded boats, often with little navigation equipment and few supplies. The risks were extreme. Storms could capsize vessels. Dehydration could set in quickly. Pirates preyed on vulnerable travelers, turning escape into terror. Yet people still went, because fear of staying outweighed fear of the ocean. Each departure was also a story of calculation and sacrifice. Families sold possessions to pay for passage. Parents tried to choose which children could go. Some boats carried people who had never seen open water before. The resulting refugee crisis spread across Southeast Asia, straining coastal communities and governments as arrivals surged. Camps formed, and international debates flared over resettlement and responsibility. The boat people story matters because it shows that the war's end did not end movement. It triggered it. It created a diaspora that would reshape communities in places far from Vietnam, carrying language, food, memory, and grief into new cities around the world. Neighboring countries struggled with camps, resettlement, and political strain. When refugees arrived in large numbers, nearby countries faced immediate human needs and long-term political dilemmas. Providing shelter meant finding land, food, medical care, and security, often at short notice and with limited resources. Camps became temporary cities with their own tensions, routines, and desperate waiting. Host governments worried about stability, public opinion, and the fear that temporary arrangements would become permanent. Some countries resisted new arrivals, pushed boats back out to sea, or demanded stronger international action. Others accepted refugees but struggled with overcrowding and funding. International agencies stepped in, yet every solution involved negotiation and compromise. The strain was not only logistical, it was political, because refugee policy can change elections, provoke unrest, and alter regional relationships. The crisis also became a moral test for the world beyond Southeast Asia. Who would open doors, and how many? Resettlement programs eventually offered new lives for many refugees, yet the process was slow, uneven, and filled with uncertainty. For families in camps, history felt like paperwork and waiting lines. Their future depended on decisions made in distant capitals. Vietnam's war scars included unexploded ordnance, still deadly in peacetime. When the shooting stops, the ground can remain armed. Unexploded bombs and shells lay hidden in fields, forests, and riverbanks, waiting for a plow, a footstep, or a curious child. In Vietnam, decades of warfare left many areas contaminated with ordnance that failed to detonate on impact. That failure turned into a long-term danger because the metal can remain lethal for generations. Farmers faced choices between caution and necessity, since productive land might also be risky land. Children sometimes found strange objects while playing, with no sense of what they held. Accidents could shatter families long after the war had faded from daily conversation. Clearing operations require expertise, equipment, and time, and the work is painstaking. Teams must locate devices, identify them, and dispose of them safely. Each item removed is a small act of repair, yet the scale of contamination makes progress feel slow. This lingering hazard changes how a country rebuilds, because it turns ordinary development into a careful negotiation with the past. A war can end on a date, yet its explosives keep writing new tragedies. Landmines and bombs continued to harm farmers, children, and builders. In the years after the war, rebuilding meant clearing rubble, planting crops again, and expanding roads and homes. Those ordinary acts became dangerous when the soil contained hidden explosives. A farmer turning earth could trigger a blast that had waited through seasons of rain and sun. A construction crew digging foundations could uncover an old device with no clear marking. Children, drawn to shiny metal or odd shapes, could be the most vulnerable because curiosity is natural and warnings can fade over time. The injuries were often catastrophic, and survivors faced long recoveries with limited resources. Communities also carried a quieter cost. Fear can keep land unused, which reduces income and slows recovery. It can also restrict children's movement, changing how families live every day. Efforts to educate, clear, and support victims became part of Vietnam's post-war story, a form of healing that required patience and international aid. Cooperation. This lingering harm is a reminder that war is not only what happens during battles. It is what remains embedded in the landscape afterward, waiting for peace to make contact. The war transformed US military doctrine, emphasizing lessons about limits. After Vietnam, American planners faced an uncomfortable truth. Superior technology and firepower did not guarantee political success. The conflict pushed the military to rethink what victory means when an opponent can avoid decisive battles, blend into civilian life, and outlast public support. Training shifted toward professionalism and readiness, with greater attention to small unit leadership, morale, and clear objectives. The United States also grappled with how to avoid open-ended commitments without a defined end state. This era helped shape ideas about force protection, intelligence, and the careful matching of means to goals. It also fed debates about counterinsurgency and conventional war, since Vietnam seemed to demand both at once. The result was not one simple reform. It was a long argument inside the armed forces about humility and capability. Vietnam became a teacher that did not speak kindly, yet its lessons echoed for decades in how the United States prepared for future conflicts. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, trying to restrain presidents. In the wake of Vietnam, lawmakers wanted to reassert a constitutional balance that many felt had slipped away during years of escalation. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was designed to limit a president's ability to commit U.S. forces to hostilities without congressional involvement. It required notification to Congress and set timelines intended to force debate and authorization. The law reflected a fear that secrecy, urgency, and political momentum could drag the country into war before citizens had a real say. Yet from the beginning, it carried tension. Presidents of both parties often argued it infringed on executive authority, and disputes over interpretation became part of American politics. Even so, the resolution became a lasting symbol of the Vietnam era's institutional shock. It was an attempt to build guardrails after a period when many Americans felt events were happening faster than oversight. The significance lies not only in the text of the law, it lies in the admission behind it. A democracy must decide how it makes war, and Vietnam convinced many that the old habits were too dangerous. Public trust in government fell, and recovery took many years. Vietnam did not single-handedly break trust, yet it accelerated a collapse that became visible across the late 1960s and early 1970s. Many citizens felt whiplash between official optimism and televised realities, between confident statements and grim outcomes. That sense of being managed rather than informed spread beyond war policy into a wider suspicion of institutions. People began to assume that hidden motives and selective truth were standard, not exceptional. The impact was cultural as well as political. Satire sharpened. Journalism became more adversarial. Young people grew more cynical about authority, while older generations argued about patriotism and dissent. Trust, once lost, is hard to rebuild because it depends on a steady pattern of honesty over time. Vietnam also taught politicians that narrative can backfire when facts catch up. The credibility gap became a kind of national wound, and it changed how Americans listened to future leaders. Even when government acted well, many people waited for the catch. Recovery was slow because skepticism became a habit, passed down like a family story. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial used names, not statues, to honor loss. When the memorial was created in Washington, its design surprised people who expected a heroic figure or a grand narrative carved in stone. Instead, a black granite wall sinks into the earth, and the names of the dead are engraved in long lines. The effect is intensely personal. You do not look up at triumph. You look into a reflective surface where your own face appears among thousands of names. Visitors touch letters, trace them with fingertips, and make rubbings on paper to carry home. The memorial does not tell you what to think about the war. It asks you to feel the weight of individual absence. That choice was controversial at first because some wanted a clearer statement of honor and pride. Over time, the wall became one of the most visited and emotionally powerful memorials in the United States. Its power comes from restraint. It turns national history into a quiet encounter between a living person and a single name, then another, then another. Agent Orange lawsuits and health studies continued long after the fighting. Decades after spraying ended, arguments over responsibility and evidence continued in courtrooms and clinics. Veterans reported illnesses they believed were linked to herbicide exposure, and they fought for recognition, compensation, and medical care. Scientific studies and policy decisions evolved over time as researchers tried to measure exposure and connect it to specific outcomes. That process was slow because wartime records were incomplete, and health effects can take years to appear. Legal action became a second battlefield, fought with documentation instead of bullets, and the stakes were survival and dignity. There were also Vietnamese victims and communities seeking remediation and support, which broadened the moral question beyond national borders. The controversy shows how war can create harm that is difficult to prove in a neat chain, even when suffering is real. It also shows how institutions respond when injuries are widespread and long delayed. Agent Orange became a symbol of unintended consequences that do not end with a ceasefire. The fighting stopped, yet the argument over accountability kept going because biology and justice both moved slowly. Veterans faced addiction, homelessness, and healing journeys often unseen. For some, the hardest battles began after returning home. Combat stress, physical pain, and the difficulty of reintegrating into ordinary life could push people toward alcohol or drugs as a form of self-medication. A veteran might struggle to sleep, struggle to hold steady work, or struggle to explain feelings that did not match the calmness expected back home. Relationships could fracture under the strain, and isolation could grow until the world felt unsafe. Homelessness became part of the Vietnam aftermath for some, and it was often linked to untreated trauma, unemployment, and lack of support networks. Yet there were also stories of recovery that rarely make headlines. Peer groups formed. Counseling improved. Community programs expanded. Some veterans found purpose through service, art, faith, or advocacy. The point is not that every veteran suffered the same fate. The point is that the war's costs did not end with demobilization. They followed people into daily routines, and the struggle for healing became a long, quiet chapter of the Vietnam story. Vietnamese families rebuilt amid shortages, grief, and profound resilience. After years of destruction, rebuilding was not a cinematic triumph. It was daily endurance. Families repaired homes with limited materials, returned to damaged fields, and tried to restore routines while carrying grief that could not be spoken easily. Infrastructure was strained, and shortages shed choices about food, medicine, and work. People who had lived through bombing and displacement faced a new kind of pressure, learning to survive in a reorganized society with new rules and expectations. Yet resilience showed in ordinary acts. Parents kept children in school when possible. Communities repaired roads and irrigation by hand. Markets reappeared, and weddings resumed, even if celebrations were modest. The ability to rebuild does not mean the pain vanished. It means people found ways to live with it. Vietnam's post-war recovery also involved memory, because families carried different experiences of the conflict and different stories about what it meant. Rebuilding a country includes rebuilding trust, which can take longer than rebuilding buildings. Their resilience is one of the most important parts of the war's legacy, because it shows what human beings can do after catastrophe, one day at a time. The war influenced cinema, producing films that argued with each other. Vietnam shaped a generation of filmmakers who could not agree on what the war meant, and that disagreement became part of the cultural legacy. Some films focused on the soldiers' psychological descent, using surreal or nightmarish storytelling to capture confusion and moral strain. Others emphasized camaraderie, sacrifice, and the bond of units under fire. Some portrayed the war as tragic futility, while others framed it as a story of betrayal by leaders or abandonment of allies. These films often spoke to the era's broader tensions about authority and truth. They also influenced how people who never lived through Vietnam imagined it. For many viewers, cinema became the war's memory, blending real details with dramatic invention. That is powerful and dangerous, because stories can clarify feelings while distorting facts. Yet the sheer variety of films is itself meaningful. It shows that Vietnam resisted a single narrative. The movies became a public argument carried out through characters and scenes, and the argument continues because the war remains emotionally unfinished for many bees, families, and nations. Vietnamese literature and poetry carried memory, sorrow, and stubborn hope. When a society has lived through prolonged conflict, art becomes a place to hold what ordinary conversation cannot. Vietnamese writers and poets used language to preserve small human moments that history books often miss. A mother waiting, a soldier thinking of home, a village trying to plant again, a child noticing what adults cannot bear to say. Some works were written during the war, shaped by urgency and survival. Others came later, when the distance of time allowed more reflection and more complexity. Literature offered a way to process loss without turning it into propaganda, though political pressures also shaped what could be published and praised. Poetry, especially, can hold contradiction in a few lines, allowing grief and love to exist side by side. For readers, these works provide an interior view of a conflict, often described through battles and diplomacy. They remind you that war is not only strategy. It is lived emotion. In Vietnamese writing, the war becomes something personal and intimate, carried forward in words that refuse to let memory disappear. The conflict changed refugee communities, reshaping cities far from Vietnam. When Vietnamese refugees resettled abroad, they did not arrive as blank slates. They carried skills, trauma, traditions, and a fierce desire to build stability. In places like California, Texas, and parts of Australia, France, and Canada, new communities formed around markets, temples, churches, and small businesses that became cultural anchors. Food became a bridge. Language schools preserved identity. Community associations helped newcomers navigate jobs and paperwork, while also mourning what had been lost. The second generation grew up balancing worlds, translating for parents while learning new norms at school. Over time, these communities influenced local culture, politics, and economies, turning refugee stories into permanent threads in the cities that received the air. Them. The transformation worked both ways. Resettlement offered safety, yet it also created longing and questions about belonging. The Vietnam War's footprint is visible in these diaspora neighborhoods, where memory lives in family stories, holiday rituals, and the quiet insistence on rebuilding. A war that began in Southeast Asia ended up reshaping urban life across the globe, not through armies, but through people starting over. Cambodia's turmoil deepened, and the region's suffering spread wider. As the Vietnam War widened, Cambodia's fragile balance collapsed under pressure from borders that did not behave like borders. Fighting spilled over, alliances shifted, and Cambodian territory became entangled in a conflict that many civilians never chose. In the early 1970s, the United States and South Vietnam carried out incursions aimed at enemy sanctuaries, and bombings struck areas where armed ETA groups operated near villages. The strain on Cambodia's government intensified, and internal conflict escalated into civil war. In that chaos, the Khmer Rouge gained ground, drawing strength from anger, fear, and dislocation. When they seized Phnom Penh in 1975, the catastrophe that followed became one of the darkest chapters of the century. Cambodia's story shows how regional wars behave like fire in dry brush. They jump, they spread, they feed on instability. The Vietnam War did not cause every Cambodian tragedy, yet it helped create conditions where violence could multiply and where ordinary people faced ruin from directions they could not control. Laos became the most heavily bombed country per person in history. For years, Laos was officially described as neutral, yet it became a hidden battleground where air power rained down with staggering intensity. The reason was strategic. Supply networks and contested territory made Laotian landscapes central to the wider war, and bombing was used to disrupt movement and pressure opponents. Villages and hillsides were hit repeatedly, and countless bombs failed to explode, leaving a dangerous legacy that remains today. The scale is difficult to grasp because it was not one dramatic campaign. It was years of sorties and repeated strikes that quietly rewrote geography. Much of it happened with limited public visibility at the time, which deepens the tragedy, because secrecy can reduce accountability. Laos civilians lived with sudden destruction, displacement, and fear that could return without warning. The phrase, "most heavily bombed per person," matters because it forces a mental reset. Laos is not a footnote. It is a central example of how wars can expand beyond the names on the headline, and how a smaller country can carry an enormous weight when great powers fight nearby. Hmong allies fought and fled, leaving a lasting diaspora story. In Laos, the Hmong people became key allies for the United States in a covert struggle tied to the wider Vietnam conflict. Many were recruited into irregular forces that knew the mountains intimately, and they carried out dangerous missions including scouting, rescue, and fighting along contested routes. Their partnership made them targets. When the war's balance shifted, many Hmong faced retaliation and persecution, and a promise of protection often felt thin against the scale of the danger. Families fled through jungles and across rivers, seeking safety in refugee camps, especially in Thailand, where waiting became its own hardship. Over time, large numbers resettled abroad, including in the United States, France, and Australia, building new communities while carrying memories of a war that was rarely acknowledged publicly. Their story is powerful because it reveals how alliances can be urgent and intimate in wartime, then complicated and incomplete afterward. The Hmong diaspora also reshaped the cultural map of cities far from Southeast Asia, keeping language and traditions alive while remembering the price of choosing a side. The war's environmental damage included cratered fields and altered waterways. War changes land in ways that outlast headlines. Bomb craters can turn farmland into uneven terrain that floods differently, drains differently, and produces less. Forests that once held soil in place can be stripped, which increases erosion and changes how rivers carry silt. In some areas, mangrove ecosystems were damaged, affecting fish nurseries and coastal protection. Waterways that supported farming and fishing became riskier, both from debris and from unexploded ordnance hidden near banks. Even when communities tried to rebuild, the land itself could resist, because the underlying systems had been disrupted. Environmental damage also has a quiet social effect. When fields produce less, families migrate. When fishing declines, livelihoods shift. When clean water becomes harder to secure, health suffers. These changes can ripple for generations, shaping development long after peace agreements. The Vietnam War is often told through battles and politics, yet the land carried its own narrative, and it was written in scars that do not heal on the human timeline. Environmental damage reminds us that war is not only human conflict. It is also a collision between violence and ecology keeps the record. Post-war Vietnam later opened economically, seeking stability through reform. After reunification, Vietnam faced immense rebuilding challenges, and the early post-war years included hardship, shortages, and rigid economic cellar controls. Over time, leaders recognized that survival required change, and the country began moving toward market-oriented reforms known as Letter Aunedi 5 1 Letter Wenedi BAI, launched in the mid-1980s. These reforms encouraged private enterprise, reduced some central planning, and opened doors to foreign investment and trade. The shift did not erase political control, yet it changed daily life. markets expanded. Consumer goods became more available. Farmers and small businesses found more room to operate. Vietnam's economy began to grow rapidly, and millions were lifted out of poverty over the following decades, though inequalities and tensions also emerged. This transformation matters because it shows how a country can pivot from war survival to development strategy. It also shows that the aftermath of conflict is not one direction. Nations can change course, revise policies, and pursue stability through pragmatism. Vietnam's reform era became a new chapter that many outsiders did not expect, shaped by memory of scarcity and a determination to build a future that felt less fragile. The legacy includes museums, memorials, and competing narratives of meaning. Few wars leave behind a single agreed story, and Vietnam is a prime example. In Vietnam, museums and memorial sites often emphasize national liberation, sacrifice, and reunification, inviting visitors to see endurance as Ya. The central theme. In the United States, memorials emphasize individual names, trauma, and a complicated national reckoning about policy and trust. In former South Vietnamese communities abroad, memory can center on loss, displacement, and a homeland left behind. These narratives do not cancel each other. They reveal how history is shaped by where you stand and what you lost. Even battlefields become interpretive spaces. A tunnel site can be framed as ingenuity or as a grim sign of how long a war can burrow into society. A preserved aircraft can be framed as triumph or as warning. The legacy is also political because control of memory can influence identity and legitimacy. This is why Vietnam remains so debated. The past is not finished. It is visited, curated, argued over, and passed down through families. Museums and memorials become places where people try to make meaning from pain, and meaning is never neutral. Families on both sides still search for remains and for closure. In Vietnam, in the United States, and among diaspora communities, the war left behind missing people whose fates were never fully known. Families searched for decades, holding onto photographs, letters, and stories that kept a loved one present even in absence. In Vietnam, the search for war dead has been a vast national effort, involving state programs, local knowledge, and the painstaking work of identifying Raltaf. Graves in remote areas. In the United States, accounting for missing personnel became a major issue, tied to diplomacy and public pressure. Yet beyond politics, there is a human truth. Without remains, grief can feel suspended. Funerals cannot happen properly. Children grow up without answers. The work of recovery and identification is slow because landscapes change, records vanish, and memory fades. Still, people persist because closure matters in a way that outsiders rarely understand. Each recovered set of remains is not only an archaeological event, it is a family being allowed to stop guessing. It is history becoming personal again, and it is a reminder that wars do not end when treaties are signed. They end when the missing are found, and many are still not. The war's lessons are taught differently, depending on country and generation. A teenager in Hanoi may learn a story of resistance and national reunification, framed as a long arc of independence. A student in the United States may learn a story about escalation, protest, and limits of power. A family in the Vietnamese diaspora may teach a story about lost homes, dangerous departures, and identity rebuilt elsewhere. Even within one country, generations disagree because each generation carries different emotional baggage. Those who lived through bombing and rationing teach differently than those who grew up during economic reform. Those who protested teach differently than those who served. This matters because education is not only about facts, It is about what a society chooses to emphasize and what it chooses to leave quiet. The Vietnam War remains a live wire partly because it touches pride, grief, and ideology all at once. When lessons differ, debates continue. Yet those differences can also be a form of honesty. A complex war should produce multiple perspectives, because reality itself was multiple. Listening across generations can reveal what textbooks cannot. It can show how history feels inside a family, and how memory shapes identity. Vietnamese reunification came with victory, hardship, and a long road forward. Reunification brought an end to division, yet it did not bring instant peace to every household. A country stitched together after decades of conflict must deal with wounded infrastructure, economic disarray, and deep political suspicion. The new state faced the challenge of integrating institutions, absorbing former enemies, and controlling territory where loyalty had been split for years. Some people celebrated, believing reunification fulfilled a historic promise. Others feared punishment, loss of status, or the erasure of their past. These mixed emotions shaped the early post-war years, along with shortages and difficult policy choices. Over time, Vietnam's leaders pursued stability, and the country gradually rebuilt. Yet the path was uneven and often painful. Reunification is often described as a finish line, yet it behaves more like a starting line. After the shooting stops, the real work begins. It is the work of reconciling narratives, rebuilding lives, and deciding what kind of nation will emerge from the ruins. Vietnam's journey forward shows how victory can be real while hardship remains real too, and how a society can carry both at once. Remembering the Vietnam War means holding complexity, not simple heroes and villains. The war refuses neat categories because its causes and consequences stretch across decades, borders, and personal lives. You can find bravery and cruelty, idealism and self-interest, sacrifice and miscalculation, sometimes in the same individual. You can find civilians trapped in impossible choices and leaders making decisions that looked rational in one moment and disastrous in another. You can also find memories that conflict without one being dishonest. A veteran may remember a friend saved by a medic. A villager may remember a home destroyed in the same campaign. A refugee may remember terror at sea. Another person may remember the relief of reunification. None of these erase the others. Holding complexity matters because simplified stories can become weapons, used to dismiss suffering or excuse policy. Complexity does not mean moral confusion. It means refusing to reduce human lives to slogans. The Vietnam War teaches that history is crowded. It contains many truths at once, and the hardest work is to listen without rushing to a verdict. When we remember it fully, we do more than recount events. We honor the real people who lived them, and we learn to recognize warning signs in the present. As we come to the end of this journey, you can feel how vast this story has been. We've moved through jungles and cities, across rivers and borders, through conference rooms and family homes. We've traced a war that unfolded over decades, shaped by global ambitions and deeply personal choices. A conflict that touched soldiers, civilians, journalists, musicians, refugees, and generations yet to be born. You've heard how the Vietnam War changed the way wars were fought, reported, remembered, and questioned. How it reshaped nations, fractured trust, and left marks on landscapes as well as on minds. You've traveled from the early struggles for independence, through years of escalation and protest, to the long aftermath of rebuilding, migration, and memory. It is a story filled with courage and suffering, endurance and loss, and the quiet determination to keep going when certainty disappears. Now, there's nothing more you need to hold on to. You can let the details drift back like footprints filling with water. Let the weight of history soften into a distant hum, no longer demanding your attention. Allow your breathing to slow, steady, and even. Let your shoulders ease and your thoughts loosen their grip, one by one. If you found something meaningful in this journey, you're always welcome to support the channel by liking or subscribing, or by sharing it with someone who might enjoy these tasks. Nighttime wanderings through history. And if you happen to still be awake, another video will be waiting for you on the screen, ready to carry you a little further. But for now, rest is enough. The story can stay here, safely held. You don't need to solve it or sort it or remember every part. Just allow yourself to sink into stillness, knowing that learning, like sleep, settles in its own time. Sleep well, and good night.